The failure of Caesar's first invasion of Britain can be put down to a mixture of poor planning and bad luck, with some classic British weather saving the day for the Celts. However unlucky Caesar might have been, though, the failure of the campaign was mostly his fault. He rushed into the invasion just before winter, late into the campaigning season, without preparing properly and with too small a force. Another disappointment of the campaign was that Britain was in fact not rich with silver as Caesar had anticipated. You wouldn't expect then that Caesar would return to Rome in glory. However, he managed to twist the tale of the campaign, making it seem as if he had thumped the Britons, and he managed to get the Senate to declare a 20 days Thanksgiving, and it enthusiastically assigned him to a second campaign into Britain for the next year. Despite the apparent zeal of the Senate, it is likely that this decision was influenced not by Caesar's friends, but by his enemies, who perhaps saw a chance to ruin Caesar's reputation on this far-off island of Britain. Perhaps when he returned from this next campaign, it would be in shame, having just overseen a military disaster. Or maybe he wouldn't return at all. Cicero voices this sentiment in a letter to his friend, in which he writes, "The outcome of his expedition to Britain is worrying, for the shores are notorious for the ramparts and sheer cliffs, and it is also known that there is not a pennyweight of silver in the island." Whatever the case of the Senate's motives, Caesar began to prepare 6 legions, 30,000 troops, and 2,000 cavalrymen for the invasion of 54 BC. Caesar was not taking any chances this time. He was determined to beat the Britons into submission. However, he left 3 legions in command of his right-hand man Labienus in Gaul because of the rebellious noises being made by the Gauls. It also seems that Caesar's willingness to return to Britain the following year, after realizing that there was no silver or riches to gain from Britain, was, while Caesar no doubt also had conquest in mind and to teach the Britons a lesson, due in part to Caesar's intention to set up a client kingdom there. Back in 55 BC, a couple of months after Caesar's invasion, a young prince of the Trinovantes tribe, who occupied the area around Hertfordshire and Suffolk, called Mandubracius, had fled to Caesar in Gaul after his father was killed by an enemy Celtic king named Cassivellaunus. Caesar welcomed Mandubracius warmly and agreed to return him to his rightful throne. In preparation for his invasion, Caesar had an enormous fleet of 600 ships commissioned, and in July of 54 BC, he transported his army across the Channel with this fleet, landing in Kent. The army of Celts that greeted the Romans were alarmed at the size of Caesar's force, and this time, with nowhere near enough numbers to do so, the Celts did not oppose Caesar's landing. Instead, they retreated to a nearby hill fort, a small, round, wooden fortress, often with a ditch built around it. They were very similar to a modern Bailey castle, and they often housed small villages. The Celts would hoard huge amounts of sling stones in these forts, so as enemies tried to force their way into the fort, they would be pelted by an unceasing barrage of sling stones. However, these hill forts were used for tribal warfare. They were not built to withstand the advanced tactics and siege machines available to the Romans. Caesar had little trouble storming the fortress, and the sling stones proved unable to do any damage as the Romans went into their testudo formation, using their large shields to their advantage. With the day drawing to an end, Caesar gave up the pursuit of the fleeing Celts, and the Romans constructed their fortified camp for the night. However, the next day, the Romans woke up to the news that yet again Mother Nature had struck. Much of the Roman fleet had been badly damaged by a storm. For this to happen a second time must have surely seemed like a bad omen from the gods. Caesar must have been exasperated. His plans for a rapid advance that would sweep the Britons away from under their feet would have to be disregarded. In the 10 days that the legions would spend repairing the ships, the Celts regrouped and banded together under the most powerful British king, Cassivelaunus of the Cativelani tribe in north of the Thames. Cassivelaunus was an astute commander, and as the campaign went on, would learn to adapt to the advanced military of the Romans. Once the ships had been repaired, Caesar once again marched inland, constantly being harassed by British cavalry in chariots. However, as the Romans began to build their fortified camp, the whole Celtic army attacked. Before we get into the battle, it's important to understand how a Celtic chariot worked. A chariot would be pulled by 2 horses, and in the chariot itself there would be 2 people, the driver and the warrior who would throw javelins. In the battle, the chariots would hurtle towards the enemy infantry, only to swerve away at the last minute, at which point the enemy would be peppered with javelins. Once the warrior ran out of javelins, he would fight in front of the chariot on foot, but if he needed to, he could always just jump back into the chariot and speed away. The Romans found it extremely hard to deal with the Celtic chariots, who were causing absolute mayhem in the Roman lines. The Roman legionaries were just not able to deal with mounted skirmishers, a fact that would become all too clear after Crassus's defeat at the Battle of Carrhae to the Parthian Persians in 53 BC. The chariot's ability to spray the Romans with projectiles, but then to sweep into the exposed flanks of groups of Romans, and then to also be able to suddenly jump out of the chariots and confront the Romans on foot, where they would fight ferociously, was proving extremely effective. Having absolutely battered the Romans, but unable to break through their lines, the Celts withdrew. Caesar now planned to cross the Thames into the land of the Trinovantes, where he planned to reinstall Mandubrecius as king, and from where he would be able to set up a base and receive supplies from Mandubrecius, but also to march into the land of the Cativelani, who Cassivellaunus was king of. Perhaps he could force Cassivellaunus into a pitched battle, which the Romans always came out on top in. Cassivellaunus pulled his forces back across the Thames to oppose a Roman river crossing. However, the Roman cavalry was especially trained for this sort of action, and once joined by the legions, the Celts fell back. Once he had crossed the Thames, Caesar marched into Cativelani territory and began razing villages to the ground and living off the land. In response, Cassivellaunus began evacuating villages and their livestock to deprive the Romans of food, but also to prevent his people from becoming Roman slaves. He also used his chariots to constantly attack the Romans, but then pull back before they could be bogged down by the legions. This tactic began to prove effective, but the tables were about to turn in Caesar's favour. Caesar advanced into Trinovantes territory and met with the elders of the tribe to discuss the reinstallation of Mandubrecius, who was promptly put back on the throne. Now that Mandubrecius was chieftain, he bent the knee in submission to Rome at the head of a small coalition of tribes who wanted to avoid falling under the yoke of the Cativelani, and provided Caesar with much-needed supplies, continuing to do so throughout the rest of the campaign. This was a big win for Caesar, and gave him a massive advantage for the rest of the campaign. Caesar, now informed of the whereabouts of Cassivellaunus' stronghold by the Trinovantes, stormed it. This crippling defeat caused very heavy losses for the Celts, who also no longer had a base of operations. British resistance slackened, and Cassivellaunus went into hiding. Thanks to the treachery of the Trinovantes, Caesar had the campaign in the bag. Cassivellaunus now instructed the Kentish tribes to attack Caesar's beachhead in a desperate attempt to cut Caesar off from Gaul. This failed, and the Roman garrison fiercely defended the beachhead, driving the Celts away. Seeing that the game was up, Cassivellaunus began to negotiate a surrender through Caesar's Gallic cavalry commander, Commius. The peace treaty, agreed by the two sides, stipulated that the Catavellani and their allies would pay an annual tribute to the Romans, something that caused a long-lasting resentment of Rome within these tribes, and that they would not depose Mandubricius or his successors, who had become a client king of Rome. It is likely that as he travelled back to Gaul, across the for once calm English Channel, Caesar had plans for Britain, where he had just established a sphere of Roman influence. However, in a few months' time, any of these plans will have to be put to rest, as rebellion will come to Gaul.